The DC Extended Universe is in its death throes. Is it the Flash or the Flush? Let's find out in this week's Nerd Byword podcast. Ladies and gentlemen, nerds, welcome to a new episode of the Nerd Byword podcast, episode 155. I'm Dave. I'm here with my buddy Kris, and this week we are reviewing the latest offering of the DC Extended Universe, The Flash. But before we jump into that particularly harrowing review, it's time for some... All right, Kris, back to the AI, I see.
So a lot of folks have been looking forward to the start of Disney Plus series Secret Invasion, based on the interesting storylines and retcons that took place in Captain Marvel, which repositioned the Skrulls as refugees. And a lot of people had written off, since they were heroic or sympathetic characters, that Marvel could never do a Secret Invasion. Well, here we are. However, when this series premiered, a lot of people are up in arms, as they are wont to do on social media, because the title sequence features artificial intelligence. It's a real hot button issue, not only in the art community, but also amongst the WGA writer's strike, with the fear that AI is going to replace real people's jobs. Ali Salim, who is one of the executive producer and director on the show, says that the intro sequence was designed by Method Studios using AI, something that he feels plays with the very themes of the show. And said, quote, "When we reached out to the AI vendors, that was part of it. It just came right out of the shape-shifting Skrull world identity, Who did this? Who is this?" End quote. And so it's a really kind of interesting debate, if not public outcry on social media at the very least, that AI is being used so blatantly in a large project like a Disney Plus MCU show. But they made it clear that no artist's, work was taken and no one lost their work over this. And I'm kind of two minds of it, honestly. Number one, it's a title sequence that most people skip. Number two, it does play with the themes of the show, not to trust what you see. But at the same time, I am in full support of artists' rights, workers' rights. And this is kind of an underlying, almost like an appetizer course of like the VFX, the ugly truth coming out, even something that we unanimously love, like Across the Spider-Verse. Vulture came out with an article. So it's a real hot button issue, Dave.
I'm, obviously have been a writer myself for a long time. And so I view AI with great skepticism, as well. I like my art to be actually created by human beings and not by computers. I'll say that you're right. These days, everybody pretty much skips the opening title sequence, which I think is super regrettable. I miss really cool opening credits. If you go back 15, 20 years, opening credits were something that could really get you pumped, for a show. It's kind of become a lost art. I'm thinking, for example, like Buffy the Vampire Slayer, those guitar riffs.
How did I know you were going to say that?
So I miss that, yeah. But I think as far as like the AI issue here, I think it's AI creep, really. I think it's really AI creep. I think what you're going to run into is that this is just like testing the waters. Well, here it makes story sense, so we just went ahead and did AI, and then the next time it's going to be something else, and it's just going to slowly start creeping more and more into the fabric of how these things are made. I'm not necessarily opposed to, I guess, artists using AI as a support tool of some way as they are, creating their art.
Yeah, I don't disagree, and I think a lot of there's been a lot of discussion on like what we should do about like the VFX side of it and the harsh working conditions. And I know that's a different news story, but I feel like it's relevant here. And I, it's really interesting. And like diving into the little bit of research that I did in prep for this episode is that VFX studios have been hesitant to unionize, so they are currently not unionized, so they could not go on strike, for example, as the writers and the screen actors have done. I think the directors have taken the deal. But so it would be interesting to kind of see if they're willing to do that, because the strategy right now is to just complain about harsh working conditions and try and publicly shame big studios like Sony or Disney or Warner Brothers. And I don't know how effective that's going to be. Corporations don't really care about things like that. You're going to have to hit them where it hurts. And that's where unionization and striking is the only really effective process. If even that now with the advent of artificial intelligence being included. All right, Dave, what do you have for us this week?
Yeah. So let's go ahead and delve back into the world of video games, a place that I definitely call home. It turns out that there's some really interesting stuff going on for the world of gaming right now that a lot of people may not be aware of, because it is involving the government and court cases, and it's not exactly the most sexy stuff to cover, but I think it's definitely something to talk about. As we've covered previously, Microsoft is trying to acquire Activision Blizzard right now for something like $69 billion, and yeah, and Sony, has kind of like filed a grievance against that because they're afraid of what that would entail for them, and the FTC has taken the stand that this is a bad thing, and has kind of started antitrust proceedings in a bid to try to block this deal from happening. And as of this recording, the first hearings have started, as the FTC and Microsoft are basically in front of a judge, in a series of hearings trying to, ascertain certain facts and whether this is really an antitrust issue or not. And there's been a whole bunch of really interesting revelations in the early goings of this process that makes the whole thing seem disingenuous, I guess is the best way to put it. Now, look, I'm not the biggest fan of ginormous corporations gobbling up other entities and becoming, how did early seasons of South Park say it, Mecha Streisand? I'm not a big fan of that concept to begin with. We see how Disney, for example, is handling stuff, and I'm not a huge fan of Disney having become this mega corporation that owns Marvel and Star Wars and pretty much anything under the sun. However, I think it's difficult to make the argument that they're making in this FTC hearing, because so many of the things that they're talking about seem really designed basically not to keep the playing field level, but to kind of defend Sony's dominant place in the marketplace. And that's why this feels really disingenuous. Good example. Let's talk about some of these revelations that have hit the news so far. First of all, the FTC is trying to argue that Nintendo is not a competitor to Xbox on the console market. Why? Because the Switch is not as high powered as far as graphical capabilities as the PlayStation 5 and Xbox Series X. The idea here is that by arguing that Nintendo is not a competitor, it now suddenly looks like Sony and Xbox have like a 50-50 market share, and that this would be like tipping the scales. But if you count Nintendo in the mix, and I think saying that they're not a competitor is incredibly disingenuous, then Xbox is pretty solidly in third place. Something that they have actually admitted in these hearings. Listen, we lost the console wars. Like, we're in third place. We're in third place most console generations. This is nothing new, right? Like, this is not going to be the thing that tips the scales. Then there's the argument about exclusivity. There's a lot of focus specifically on Call of Duty in particular, but the FTC argued stuff like, what if there's a really cool skin and you make this really cool skin exclusive to Xbox? Isn't that unfair to
Kind of
Sony?
like what Sony does.
And that's kind of like, you flip it around and you're like, well, these are things that have already happened, and Sony does that too. This is part and parcel of the industry, right? Then and that's not the only exclusivity issue. They started talking about Starfield, because obviously Bethesda is a more recent acquisition of Microsoft's, and Starfield is going to be Xbox exclusive now. And originally the announcement was that it was going to be multi-plat. Well, it turns out, as has been revealed in these hearings, that the reason that Xbox has decided to go exclusive with this game is because that's what Sony was trying to do. Sony was actually trying to pay a substantial sum to Bethesda in order to make Starfield either a completely PlayStation 5 exclusive or a timed exclusive. And one of the reasons that Microsoft then swooped in and purchased Bethesda is to avoid situations like that where they're being shut out in the future. So, the purchase of Bethesda was in some ways reactionary when it comes to actions that Sony was taking. But I think the most interesting revelation in all of this is that Sony is particularly really talking out of both sides of its mouth at this point, because they're making the argument that they're afraid that a juggernaut like Call of Duty is suddenly going to be exclusive to Xbox, right? But in the openings of these proceedings, there was an email exchange that was entered into the record between Sony's PlayStation chief, Jim Ryan, and another guy, Chris Deering, who is the former CEO of Sony Computer Entertainment. And here is what Ryan said in this email. It is not an exclusivity play at all. They're thinking bigger than that, and they have the cash to make moves like this. In other words, Ryan wasn't concerned about Call of Duty exclusivity because he had spoken to the Activision CEO at the time and Xbox chief Phil Spencer, and had reassurances that that was not going to happen. And in fact, Sony made moves even to counter this whole thing by then very quickly announcing that they were purchasing Bungie. Right? So Sony basically at the time that this was announced said, hey, I'm not worried about this. Call of Duty is still going to be coming to PlayStation. We have assurances that this is the case. And now they kind of flipped around. And this makes the whole proceedings not feel, at least so far, like really a case of the government trying to pursue antitrust and monopoly in the market in the video game space. It really almost feels like a defense of Sony's market dominance, specifically when they are pointing at practices that Microsoft has done that Sony does as well. But for some reason, when Sony does it, I guess it's fine. But when Microsoft does it, it's not, right? So this has been a really interesting situation. And I'll plan to watch this very carefully to see where all this is going, Chris.
Since we're introducing South Park references, wow, the tears of unfathomable sadness from Sony gamers, quite like Scott Tenorman. No, listen, it's not so much fun when someone else holds the gun, is it? Sony has made that almost like this, and I've detailed my feelings about this since the inception of this show. PlayStation gamers and Sony itself, it feels like gatekeeping and bullying, like how dare you purchase another system. They are elitist, and I have no sympathy or empathy for them. The only reason that they're kicking up a fuss now is because someone is trying to give them a taste of their own medicine. And I'm not caping up for Microsoft. I'm just a happy Xbox gamer. But big corporations are bad. Like, eat the rich, like all that stuff. But come on, stop it. Stop acting like you're on this altruistic campaign to save whatever. I don't even care about Call of Duty. I haven't played Call of Duty since 2007. Couldn't care less about Activision Blizzard. Okay, but the hypocrisy is astounding. It's astounding. Just because people can simultaneously have an Xbox and a Switch, or have a PS5 and a Switch because they want that, doesn't mean it's not a competitor. Just because I eat at McDonald's and Burger King doesn't mean they're not competitors. Okay? Like, come on, get out of here.
Yeah, like I said, a lot of this feels really disingenuous, and really designed to sort of protect Sony's place. It's really weird to me too, because like Sony, maybe not to the scale of what Microsoft is doing here, but Sony has been playing this game. I mean, they purchased Insomniac, right? They purchased Bungie. Insomniac has been, even before they were bought up, pretty much been making almost exclusively games for PlayStation, right? So are we saying that Insomniac in this purchase should make sure that all of its games are available on both platforms? Like, if Microsoft purchases Activision Blizzard, it is within their right to say certain games are exclusive, and they're really tying themselves into knots here. To try to make everybody happy, like they're saying they're committed to keeping Call of Duty on a multi-plat. They're committed to offering their games on competing cloud services, because the FTC is very worried about cloud for some reason. And they're like, okay, we'll throw all our games on competing cloud services too, not just xCloud, whatever. Like they're jumping through all these hoops and making all these promises that nobody is demanding Sony does. Like if Sony, starts building, really strong cloud services.
Sony can't even come out with like a cost-effective system. Like they have the Series X for the Xbox. Like that's the pinnacle of whatever the specs you want. But for people like myself who are just, want to play the game and don't care about FPS and don't care about like all the bells and whistles, you can get the Series S for half that price. Sony doesn't have that option. It's the disc option or the no disc option, and there's not a huge bit of difference in that. And so for them to sit there and tout, like, are you going to make God of War available for other consoles? Are you going to make Spider-Man available for other consoles? Oh, you're not? Get out of here. I do want to ask you, what do you think of Phil Spencer saying that console wars are a social construct? I thought that was interesting.
I think to say that these companies are not in direct competition with each other is, obviously ridiculous. However, I really like what Spencer said, and in a lot of ways, I like a lot of the things that Spencer has done since he's come to Xbox and taken over. He's definitely tried to right the ship after the really horrific launch of the original Xbox One. But I kind of agree with him. Like it's just another way that people separate themselves into camps so they can say I'm better than you.
The tribalism. Yeah.
I mean, not everybody can do this. Obviously, I do invest a significant amount of cash into gaming because it's one of my main pastimes. But I have a PS4 sitting in there. I got an Xbox One X sitting in there, and I have my Nintendo Switch. Like I have one of each, and my wife has her own Switch as well, and so there's very little tribalism. I mean, I remember some of that when I was a kid. I predominantly had Nintendo consoles, and the Sega kids were always very upset with me that I didn't have a Sega console. But that was more of a function of economics. Like I couldn't afford both, so I picked the one that had games on it that I gravitated towards. It wasn't tribalism. So yeah, I agree. Console wars are a social construct, and I think the aging demographic among gamers has perpetuated that. I think that a lot of gamers of my generation are still kind of nostalgic, I guess, for the glory days of Nintendo versus Sega, and they're kind of trying to keep that alive in a Sony versus Xbox situation. And I just think that's really silly.
It's funny that you say that, because I didn't even know that Nintendo versus Sega was a thing until like last year. Like I guess where I guess where I'm introverted, and I was like, I didn't have like a whole huge sprawling friend group. I was the only boy in my household, and so I just stayed in my room playing Super Nintendo, just content with life. Like I never knew about any of that.
Dude, the slogan of Sega at one point was "Sega does what Nintendo don't." like they were really in your face and blatant about it, like very, very much so, you know?
I did have a Dreamcast, but that's the next generation, so couldn't tell you.
Yeah, so this is definitely a story to keep an eye on as it progresses. I think this is supposed to stretch all the way potentially into August, which would be very bad for Microsoft because they have to, I think, close on this deal by July 18th, or the whole thing is going to fall through. So, alrighty, folks, there you have it. That's nerd news. If you'd like to jump onto social media and tell us what you think of the AI-generated opening credits for Secret Invasion, or the revelations so far from the FTC Microsoft hearings, you can find us on Twitter and Instagram at NerdByword, or individually at ThatNerdDave and at ThatNerdChris. So let's take a quick break, and when we come back, we're going to be reviewing The Flash. Welcome back, nerds. The DC Extended Universe is in its death throes. It's almost time to move on to a new cinematic incarnation of DC movies, but we have to burn off a few more movies before we get there. And one of those is The Flash, which we will be reviewing in this week's All right, so this is a classic movie review stuff. We are going to each have 3 likes and 3 dislikes, and then we're going to give the movie a final grade. Let's go ahead and jump right in. A lot of people have been talking about this one, Chris, so I don't think it needs a whole lot of introduction. What is your first like of The Flash? You can tell I'm laughing.
I'm glad this movie's over and been released. And I'm glad we're almost done with this first iteration of the DCEU. I'm ready to wipe the slate clean. The only 2 remaining entries, you can correct me if I'm wrong, I think the only 2 remaining entries are Aquaman 2 and Blue Beetle, both of which I'm very excited for, Blue Beetle in particular, but we're almost there. We are almost at the finish line. We are almost at the graveyard. And I can't wait for it to be over and we just wipe the slate clean. I need the Men in Black memory wipe thing for some of these movies, and this was one of them. I don't want to put the cart before the horse, but I did not like this movie. I had to struggle to find 3 likes, but I'm glad that it's over. And the whole, will they release it with Ezra Miller? Won't they? What will they do? All this hullabaloo. I'm just glad it's over, and it's the box office turd that it is.
Yeah, I actually texted you while I was watching it, and I said this is making me nostalgic for the Snyder Cut because it was quite a slog to get through. So I was quite pleased when the movie was over as well. And I think it's fair to say that the DC Extended Universe, as it stands, has been a really, really mixed bag. And the Flash as a character has definitely fallen more on the negative side than the positive. Because this particular, Ezra Miller's interpretation of Barry Allen does not particularly feel like Barry Allen, any incarnation of Barry Allen, whether that's comics or TV or whatnot. And so it's very, very difficult to get a good hold of this character and any enjoyment because it's so far out of the left field, both in writing and performance from what you expect from a Barry Allen. So, me too, I guess. I'm glad it's over, about to be over too.
Okay, so I just can't help but be a type 2, and I want to see my friends and family happy, and I want to do nice things for those that are close to me, and that's why the only real positive that I had from this movie, I let you have here with your first like, Dave.
And that is so nice of you because am I going to mispronounce the name again? Probably, but
two L's make a Y sound. Come on now.
2 L's make a Y, so it's Sasha Calle. Aye, she was awesome. Like, I love this version of Supergirl. Really, really did. I liked the look. although it's very divergent from the comic books. There's something about the suit design. There's something about the hair do that she sports in this. There's something about the general vibe that she projects. Like wounded. Because she's been locked up for so long, but at the same time, you know remembers that the symbol on her chest is supposed to stand for hope and still tries to do the right thing. I really like how she moved. There was something very different from other Kryptonians, or even from Superman. If you look even at like the whole breadth of the DCEU, there was something very different about how she fought, how she kind of reared back and then charged forward. She had that move like several times, and I thought it was so, like, I don't know, it was just a very cool visual. She had a very unique way of how she moved in fight scenes that I really appreciated. And one of the few scenes in the whole movie that I think really worked and actually elicited an emotional response from me is when they're trying to give Barry Allen his powers back by getting him struck by lightning. That whole scene was silly, but then she shows up and she lifts him up into the storm. She carries him up into the sky, and she just looks at him and says, "I got you." And it's just like, that was one of the few moments where it's like, bam, I felt that one. That was a cool moment that felt really unearned in the grand scheme of the movie, but it was just a really cool, moment. And I'll also go so far as to say, even, not on screen, I think she really, really lived up to the role of Supergirl. I mean, they made her sort of like the main face of this movie, as far as like the press junket and doing interviews and everything. Given all the problems that the star of this movie has had, all the baggage associated with them, and she carried this just flawlessly. Like it's even so regrettable how little she is ultimately in this movie, considering that she was probably the most mesmerizing thing on screen for the runtime of this movie. Like, I wish we would have gotten a lot more of her. And that's really regrettable, because I was one of the main voices when, this movie was first announced and what it was going to be like. That said, I just want the Flash in a Flash movie. Like, can we just do a movie about the Flash? I don't need Batman and I don't need Supergirl. I just want the Flash. But ultimately, she was the most interesting thing on screen throughout. So anytime she showed up, it was gold. And I know they've already announced they're making a Supergirl movie based on Woman of Tomorrow. And I think it's probably fair to say they're likely to recast. A lot of stuff kind of has gone down the toilet because this movie has bombed. But I really, really, really wish that they would keep her around and give her another crack at this character. Because I think she has great, great potential to be like one of the definite Supergirls, period.
Yeah, and so like sorting through the rubble that is this movie, it's like I said, it's the only net positive that I see from this film, and unfortunately, I think she may be a casualty of this film, and it's deeply regrettable. And it's almost sickening how she was utilized, and the fact that she was destined to die no matter what. Like, that was gross. That and Keaton's Batman as well. Like, they both were just destined to die. That was it was nothing short of gross. And if they do indeed recast and they don't use her in the future, which is, I think, is a huge misstep, and it would be a huge blunder, then I'm excited to follow the career of Sasha Calle myself, like whatever work she does in the future.
I will also say that I seem to recall seeing on social media that she posted that there had been some talks between her people and Warner. I'm really, really hoping that this is a good sign that they might keep her around.
If for no other reason, then, as you said, she had to be the face of this movie because of Ezra Miller's antics. And so, if for no other reason, like, she deserves this. Like, she had to do the press junkets. She did the posing with the action figure on social media, like, did all the interviews. Like, she deserves this.
Yeah, I agree. All right, Chris. So, what is your second like of the Flash?
Now, I have been one of the greatest critics of Batfleck. I just don't buy it. It just doesn't work for me. I think it's a miscast, but in a movie where I'm scrambling to find anything that I liked, I think he was a pleasant surprise. More out of the costume, surprisingly, than in. Um, the voice still feels like he's putting on something. Like it feels rehearsed. It doesn't feel natural. But he was a pleasant surprise, and I kind of dug what Affleck was doing here. And like I said in my first, like, I'm just glad we're done.
Yeah. So, do you mind if I just go ahead and launch into my second like, because
Yeah,
it is
absolutely.
extremely
Yep.
related to this? I agree that Affleck was a very, very pleasant surprise. I actually liked quite a bit about that opening sequence, although I did not like that basically, again, this is supposed to be a Flash movie, and it didn't really oftentimes feel like a Flash movie. Like, the opening is very much like Flash is errand boy for Batman, And he even says at one point, I know I'm like the guy who cleans up the messes in the Justice League, but why am I always cleaning up bat messes, But what I really liked is, for one, the blue cowl and cape. I don't think the design was perfect, but I always liked the gray and blue look in the comic books. And the fact that they set this scene in daytime, I think really leaned into that a little bit. I'm really hoping that that's a look that they emulate in the future as a suit. It doesn't have to be this suit, but having like multiple suits for Batman makes sense anyways. And so having like this lighter with the blue and the gray, I always really liked. I liked Affleck's performance here. I thought he was perfectly fine, especially as Bruce Wayne. I said there were only a handful of scenes that really had any kind of emotional resonance. But when him and Barry are talking about the possibility of Barry going back in time,
that's the scene. Yeah,
and how he talks about how his scars define him, and that he wouldn't take like that. That was a really, really good scene. And then when talking about the Batman situation of it all, dude, I liked Keaton a lot in this again. I know that there were some issues there too. The horrible wig there at the start was laughable when he was first introduced. But it's shocking to me how natural this role comes to Keaton, even as long as it has been since he's played it. Like as you said, when Affleck is Batman, it feels like he's putting on a voice. With Keaton, it doesn't feel like he's putting on a voice. Like he sounds different as Batman, but it seems very natural. And I think he did a really, really good job, which again makes me regret that we didn't get to see Batgirl, because seeing him in that context, a little bit more Gotham City based and not, in this really weird hodgepodge of a movie, would have been really interesting. So the Batman situation was cool, I think, except for the last shot of the movie. I did not need to see George Clooney as Bruce Wayne again. I thought that was the height of silliness. I know that they were left with a difficult situation. So my understanding is that originally the ending was going to be that Michael Keaton gets out of that limo, right? And the implication is that when, he fixed the timeline, that Keaton's Batman and Kaye's Supergirl were folded into his timeline, right? And that's why we had Keaton then again in the Batgirl movie, right? This was going to be like the Batman of the DCEU going forward. And then when that became not the direction they're going in, they kind of scrambled. Miller was not really available for any kind of reshoots to redo the ending, which is why you never see the two in a shot together, right? It's just kind of like A, B, back and forth. And so they decided on this gag ending. But I think the gag ending probably did more to damage the movie than anything else. And I'll talk about that, I think, in my dislikes a little bit. But yeah, the Batman situation was shockingly cool here. Nostalgia, a little bit, sure. But I think both Affleck and Keaton kind of brought it here.
Oh, I think my overarching reaction, aside from my love for Sasha Calle and hope that she gets future work in DC superhero movies, is just made me all the more pissed off about the Batgirl situation. I think that's probably my greatest takeaway. Like, this is the movie. This is the movie with a lead actor as problematic as they come, and all of the mess, and like, this is the cash cow that they had to absolutely release. Everything else is a tax write-off. This is the movie instead of Batgirl. Like, come on. Okay, but I don't want to get to the dislikes too much. I do want to say, as a Batman Forever defender, I would have liked to see Val Kilmer.
You know what? Me too.
I love Val Kilmer, and I know that Val's been through a lot, and he's in a different stage in his life, but that would have made me oh so happy. But yeah, outside of the like, I texted you this. Like, this movie is so deeply unserious, to borrow a phrase from our Gen Z kids. Like, it's so unserious. We have a baby in a microwave. We have a baby in a microwave.
I don't want to further discuss that scene. It's nightmare fuel.
And then everything about Keaton's intro is so goofy. Like, the long-haired hippie in slippers or sandals or whatever. Like, it's so unserious. So outside of Keaton's intro, loved it.
Yeah, see, that's I totally agree with that. That opening scene with him when he was first introduced, I hated that. But everything after that, he felt very much of Batman, and I liked it a great deal. I like his performance. It's just Keaton is, Keaton is one of those guys that he can read the phone book and you're going to be entertained in some way. The guy has always been really charismatic and magnetic to watch. I'm not the biggest fan of the fact that they're making another Beetlejuice, but I can't help myself. I'm probably going to check it out just because I really like Keaton. So, we'll see. All right, Chris, what is your final like of the movie?
I think our likes are intertwined here as well. So I'll start with mine and we'll probably expound into yours. I think the idea of a younger Barry was promising. Just the execution was god-awful. I don't know what the hell WB has going on with their wig department. We start with Jesse Eisenberg's Dead Shrew. We go to hippie. No, then we have I'm the little lad who loves berries and cream with younger Ezra Miller. And then we have hippie Keaton. Like, it's so bad. Like, the entire hair situation for these characters is just god awful. But I keep telling myself this is the likes section. The idea of an 18-year-old Barry is great. Did they execute it? God, no.
Yeah, I think there was some potential here for a decent movie, at least, right? And I think that's my final like here. So there was a lot of potential. The movie squandered quite a bit of it. But the idea of kind of going back in time, facing off with your younger self, dealing with the person you were, and then moving forward from that, closing a chapter in the book of your life, all of that stuff, is very interesting. It didn't help, I think, in some ways that young Barry was not the younger version of the Barry we were following. Like, he was very different because he had grown up with a mother and everything. So he was just a very different person. So, for much of the movie, it felt like, let's say, quote unquote, our Barry never was looking at young Barry as a younger version of himself, but more like a different version or an alternate possibility, right? So he never really had to face off like with his past or who he was growing up or anything like that. There was a real disconnect between the two characters, considering they were supposed to be the same person. But yeah, there was definite potential here, I think. And that's definitely a positive. I mean, I don't know, man. I think we're going to have to get into dislikes. I'm struggling.
We need an Elseworlds of what this movie could have been.
You mean an episode where we fix it? I'm going to need at least a year before we revisit this one. I need a break.
Yeah. And therapy.
Probably. All right, let's jump into the dislikes, Chris. What have you got?
And I've seen interviews where there was ideas introduced here and there were cut. I don't know the whole shebang about it. But Dave, how many... Help me out here, because I tapped out after the beginning of season 3. The Flash on the CW has been running for like 9 seasons, correct?
9 seasons, yes, sir.
9 seasons. One of the most successful, even if it's not catered to my taste, one of the most successful superhero television series. And it's all centered around the character you're trying to feature here. And he doesn't make an appearance? Not using Grant Gustin, who, even my misgivings about the show, are strictly with the script and like just the cartoonish, like, oh, Barry's goofing up the timeline again. Grant Gustin is great in the role of the Flash. And not using him here and instead doubling down, quite literally, you doubled down on your problematic lead in exchange for that is an unforgivable sin, in my opinion.
How wild would it have been if he goes back in time and young Barry is Grant Gustin?
He has a youthful face. It could easily be done.
And it's like, hey, why I suddenly look different? Like it would have been an interesting one, I think. But even in that cursed cameo section of the movie, the fact that they basically have like, I don't know, random AI generated Flash, Jay Garrick in there, like they couldn't even bother to have John Wesley Shipp in there or something. I just boggles the mind. It's very, for a movie that is like the Flash's first solo cinematic outing, it's very disrespectful to the history of the character. It seems like such a weird thing to not reference the past of that character on television in any way, shape, or form. I don't get that at all.
Okay, Dave, I think your first dislike is the long and the short of it. Even though Thomas Wayne has guns as Batman and he has a red costume.
I'm just not a big fan of Flashpoint, man. And maybe a lot of that has to do with that I never really felt it was a very good Flash story. It's one of 8 trillion alternate timeline or alternate universe stories where everything goes sideways for DC. And there's been so many of those over the years, And Flashpoint is just really, in a lot of ways, another one of those. And when you look at the Flashpoint comic story, what kind of holds that story together and makes it at least a little bit more about the Flash is the fact that, you have Reverse Flash there as the guy who's sort of revealed to be the one who, killed Barry's mom and is sort of the main mastermind behind all that, blah, blah, blah. And of course, that's been, sort of omitted here. And they never really like address in the movie, like, how Barry's mom died, right? Like, I'm not the only one that feels that way. Like
there's also like Zod. There's no real big bad. Like Zod is sure like that. Maybe that's another dislike, but like there's no like objective villain. Like I have to defeat this person because this.
Yeah. And there's just so much here that completely went off the rails because Flashpoint is just not a very good Flash story. It, was used by DC Comics, sort of the reboot into the New 52, right? And if that's what they were trying to do here, is to use this movie as saying, okay, this is, we're changing everything, and this is why the DC extended universe is going to be different from now on. I would at least kind of understand why they went with that as their Flash movie. But considering how many better Flash stories there are that are actually focused on the Flash and his supporting characters, like, a lot of Flash's supporting characters were barely even blips in this because he spends like 90% of the movie in an alternate timeline, right? So it's just not a very good story that focuses on the Flash. And because of that, I think the movie misses the mark by a huge margin. We just needed some actual Flash, if that makes sense. I mean, there is like a scene at the beginning of the movie where these two people are like teasing him or something. And one of them is supposed to be, if I understood like the credits correctly, is supposed to be Patty Spivot. Like she's, a supporting character from Flash comic books. And I don't think she ever actually even went named. Like she was there for like 2 seconds and she was gone. And I think that's sort of the underlying problem of this movie is that it is not concerned with being a Flash movie. It's really more concerned with being a DC movie, if that makes sense. And I think that's why it misses the mark by a pretty wide margin for me.
And while we're combining, we're sharing is caring here today, Dave. If you don't mind, I'm going to go straight into my second dislike.
Do it.
So, Iris West, even in my peripheral casual fan knowledge, I know that is a pretty important character in the Flash universe, correct?
Yes, sir.
and Kiersey Clemons is a promising, casting in the role. I think the world of Candace Patton, especially all the BS she's had to put up with. And let's be honest, she was one of the main reasons I kept tuning in. But I think Kiersey Clemons is well cast in the role. So let's recap here. Kiersey Clemons as Iris West, I believe, has 0 speaking lines in Justice League, Zack Snyder's Justice League extravaganza. 0 speaking lines, and she's.
I think the hot dogs had more speaking lines in that scene.
And then she's less than an afterthought in this movie. And then when they do portray her, she's a journalist that oversteps her boundaries and makes him feel uncomfortable. They have a beer, and then she shows up at the end. Like, how do you tell, to your point, a Flash story, particularly Barry Allen, and that's how you treat Iris West? It's just unforgivable.
Again, because the movie is centered on the concept of an alternate timeline, and you can't really do anything with the Flash as supporting characters in an alternate timeline when this is the very first movie featuring or focusing on the Flash and featuring many of these supporting characters. We've talked about this before, but the fun of an alternate timeline is always that the original timeline is well established, you understand and know the characters well, and then you can play inversion with those characters, right? And one of the things that didn't work here is, we didn't have the supporting characters to lean into because we didn't know them. And then even the alternate versions of characters we did get, there is no DCEU Supergirl, so this isn't an alternate version of Supergirl that we can compare and contrast. So all you're really left with is Batman, but this isn't really an alternate version of Batman so much as it is a retro throwback version to the old 89 movie, right? So the fun of the alternate timeline storytelling tropes is pretty much out the window with this movie.
I think one of the biggest disappointments in this movie is it almost rubs salt in the wound for how poorly this universe has been set up. Like, how is it we're in the death throes of the DCEU and we're getting our first Justice League team up, almost like a casual, you know what I'm saying? Sure, we had the Justice League movies, but this is this is an opening of a comic book where the Justice League is wrapping up one of these crimes and saving the day. This should not be happening now. This has have been established in the second or third film in this connected universe. And the entirety of the Justice League is Batfleck, Barry Allen's Flash, and a Gal Gadot's Wonder Woman who shows up late and is in one cameo with a line or two. That's the Justice League?
Am I the only one who feels that they are burning off her contractual appearances with these really short cameos? We had her in Shazam, we have her here. It almost feels like they're just burning off her appearances that are contractually obligated or something.
As someone who isn't a huge fan of her acting, I'm kind of okay with that. It's the first Wonder Woman film is okay, and it's almost become a meme at this point. Enough champagne to fill the Nile, that whole thing. Kal-El, no, I'm okay with that, but there's no cohesive nature to any of this.
Yeah, you're not wrong, man.
Which I think directly, man, we're of one mind today. That directly ties into your second dislike.
The movie never really coalesces around a clear conflict or a clear message. You've already pointed out that Zod is here, but he's certainly not the main antagonist or the main goal to overcome, because ultimately Barry decides, I can't save this world, so oops, and then this future version of young Barry that has kind of gone bad is on screen for 2 minutes tops, and is certainly not the main obstacle to overcome. So if you then boil it down, what is the obstacle to overcome in this movie? Well, I mean, it has potential, because the idea is that Barry needs to learn some lessons, to let go of the past, to move forward into the future, to understand that he can't mess with the past. Okay, sure. So the main conflict here is then an inner conflict. If done well, that can work. But that doesn't really coalesce either, because there's just too many things here that do not make sense. So let's go ahead and go back to hippie Bruce Wayne for a second and his totally awesome bowl of multiversal spaghetti. So the theory that he postulates is that when Barry went back in time and changed one thing, namely that whole tomato can situation, that it wasn't a singular pivot point and everything moving forward from that point would be different, but that when you change something in the past, that there are ripples that go both forward and backwards through time and change all sorts of stuff. And so by messing with the space-time continuum, you're creating, in essence, alternate timelines, a multiverse. Okay, I'm with you so far. The only problem is when Barry says, well, I can't save this world, this is just where this world dies, and then turns around and changes the tomato can situation to restore everything, because that should only be a solution if we're talking about this being one cohesive timeline and not a multiverse. So basically what we're looking at, if this was a multiverse accidentally created by the Flash, he just like let an entire planet die and then just went back home, right? That also throws really the ending into question, right? Because if he created by changing the past a multiverse those ripples basically create alternate timelines but don't affect the main timeline, then why was there a different Bruce Wayne when he came back? None of that makes sense. But the most important thing, I think, ultimately, that kind of defeats the central inner conflict of this movie is that Barry is supposed to learn to let go of the past and to move forward into the future, that he cannot change the past. And how does the movie resolve? Instead of moving one tomato can, he just moves a whole crap ton of tomato cans. He is still changing something in the past in order to affect the future. He has not, in fact, actually learned his lesson. So the inner conflict of this movie is completely flushed down the toilet. And devoid of a really interesting conflict, either external or internal, the movie just becomes a collection of scenes.
Speaking of tomatoes, I would like to throw tomatoes at this movie if at all possible. So I don't know about cans; that seems a little bit too violent. But I would like to throw tomatoes at this movie. I think it all boils down to I really hate this trope of messing with the timeline, the butterfly effect, what have you. It's just such a tired and played out. And I swear to God, I want to put a ban on multiverse stories for this foreseeable future. I'm at my limit of, not only because we can't tell a good story, whatever. These are so unimaginative when it comes to the multiverse. We talked about this with Doctor Strange. It really kind of dropped the ball on what you could play with when you have endless possibilities. Okay. Now they kind of recoup some of that with the musical note fight scene and stuff like that. But, as you correctly pointed out, in contrast to something like Everything Everywhere All at Once, that's the big leagues, baby. If you want to tell a multiverse story, that's the big leagues. That's the mark. Okay. And so everything kind of pales in comparison. Your idea for an alt universe is Barry in a bad wig. Come on.
I got nothing to add. You're correct. All right. That brings us to your final dislike of the movie.
So I feel it's kind of apropos that I talked about artificial intelligence for my news story, because nearly everything about this film felt like artificial intelligence. Almost like a cautionary tale. Listen, those writers are right to be on strike because this felt like it was written by AI. Uh, everything about this film felt artificial and hollow. It's almost like it was paint by numbers. It was incredibly predictable. Like, and there was no emotional resonance. Like, even the stuff that we're supposed to like care about, like everything to do with Barry's mom, felt like it was being like our face was being dunked underwater and they were telling us to drink. This is the part where you drink. How his mom, bless her, didn't recognize him as the stranger she hugged in the grocery store at the end. Like, that was foolish. That was goofy. The script was so cheap. Like, it wasn't even CW level script. It was like Hallmark Channel level script.
Ooh.
Like, it's bad. It's bad. And the only way I can get through those movies if I've got some eggnog, and I'm talking the good eggnog around the holidays. Everything about this movie was just kind of soulless. Like, it did not land on anything. And I think maybe that's like a meta-contextual thing where you have this problematic person who at the center of the role who can't stay out of their own way in Ezra Miller, and Barry can't stay out of his own way as the central character, like can't stop effing everything up. Like, it's just, I'm just glad it's over, man.
Yeah. Well, sharing is caring, right? So since we're talking about artificial, let's go ahead and talk about my final dislike. The special effects in this movie did not really work. And I'm sure that there's a multitude of reasons for this. Time pressure, changing, situations. God knows what all was going on behind the scenes. This movie was like cursed for years, even trying to make it. So it's hard telling what like the underlying issues were that the special effects team encountered. But there is something very, well, as you said, artificial, very fake about many of the special effects shots, and they really, really take you out of the movie. That's really regrettable. Now, we've talked a lot about questionable special effects, in recent Marvel productions, but I have to say this one was really taking the cake. The scene, which I absolutely despised in the beginning, when he's trying to save the babies that are all flying out of a hospital window, those were some really uncanny valley babies, man. Like, the emotion of the moment was completely lost because it was so clear. Like, the dancing baby from Ally McBeal looked more realistic, I think.
Listen, also, here's what I thought. I've already seen this. It's bad if a Fox X-Men movie does this better than you.
Yes.
Quicksilver, Evan Peters' Quicksilver did this loads better than you.
Yes, absolutely. And then we have a lot of the fight scenes. I really liked, again, how Sasha Kaye moved in those fight scenes. But anytime that she transitioned from being her to being CGI, the shots just looked so oddly rubbery and fake. It was it's very, very clear where the special effects started and stopped. You know what I mean? When it was her, it looked good, but when it transitioned to the CGI, there was this really rubbery, stretchy. It was very odd, and I feel almost bad for the director because some of the shots, the way they were, you can see that they're set up, looked really cool, right? But the special effects never quite achieve the level of realism to make it look good. I'm thinking, for example, about like when the Batwing crashes and Batman has ejected and is slowly going down towards the ground with his cape, like that shot looked really cool, but the special effects looked so PS2. It was very hard to, it's very hard to feel that moment when it was so artificial. And then the cameos, man. That whole scene where they're looking at like the multiverse and the various planets collapsing and everything was so bad. It was so bad. When Chris Reeve's Superman like landed and the camera like focuses in on him and you realize who it is, it looked like a cardboard cutout. I mean, it really truly did. The Nicolas Cage thing, he looked basically like somebody was wearing a Nicolas Cage rubber mask.
I swear to God, someone said that he was on set for that, and I said, BS. There's no way.
I'm not buying that either. But as much as I'm a huge, Chris Reeve fan. I love his Superman, and I love him in a lot of roles. Um, but the thing that really kind of got to me was that they actually had a cameo of the George Reeves Superman. And so if you know a little bit of the background there, um, he was never particularly thrilled with that role, and he got really famous for it and typecast for it, and he was really down that he couldn't do other things anymore. And his death, is very controversial and mysterious. Was officially ruled a suicide, and there's speculation that maybe his declining status in Hollywood and his typecasting as a children's character contributed to some kind of depression. And so, given the complexities of George Reeves's history, to then, revive him like this and put him back on the screen as Superman, a role that he was really conflicted about and that may have even contributed potentially to his death, feels so icky. That whole sequence was just icky from top to bottom. CGI resurrecting Chris Reeves just to go ahead and have his whole reality collide with another reality and kill him off. It's just weird, man. Like, there were so many odd choices being made in that scene. And the special effects did not help a lick. It was the weirdest looking, fakiest looking. It didn't sell the product. And I understand, CG, blah blah blah, special effects are hard, blah blah. I understand all this, right? But then you got to make some choices, right? If you can't pull it off, then go in a different direction.
Yes.
Like let's go ahead and say this computer generated Chris Reeve looks awful. The computer generated Helen Slater looks awful. Okay, what can we do? Well, MFers Brandon Routh is right there. Okay, so let's go ahead and use him, and Melissa Benoist is right there. So let's go ahead and use her, and there you have a Superman and Supergirl. Boom shakalaka, problem solved, right? There are, Nicolas Cage's CGI model looks horrible. Then bring the guy on set, fit him in a Superman outfit. You cannot tell me that making a Superman suit for this cameo for Nicolas Cage would have been more expensive than that god awful CG. I don't believe that for a second.
And you can't tell me that Nicolas Cage, as campy as Nicolas Cage is, that he wouldn't be down for that.
He totally would have been down for that. So I don't know,
also,
man.
Here's another one. We had a bad CGI Henry Cavill.
Don't even, man.
Come on.
As if you couldn't bring him in, really? It's at some point you got to just make some tough choices, right? And if something doesn't work, then you got to go in a different direction. You just have no choice in the matter, because as it is, what we've released here is a movie that feels, at least from the effect side, deeply unfinished. And it's visually very jarring when you're watching this movie. It's very, very jarring to get anything out of this. As much as I loved Michael Keaton in the role, what was wrong with putting like a stuntman in that suit for many of the action sequences? Why was there so much CGI Michael Keaton Batman? Like let's rather do it a little bit more realistically, a little more groundedly, and get something out of it. Rather than going full fakey and then taking everybody out of the moment in the movie. Like, that was probably the thing that took me out of the story over and over again the most, is when those special effects shots kicked in. And you know what? I'm going to say it again. Don't get me started on how bad the running looks in these movies. It's bad when season 1 of The Flash, the running scenes looked better than they do in this picture. For a major motion picture, this is just not good. And what's with that goofy pose that Ezra Miller always pulled before he started running? Like, I know that like one of the things that they tried to do when Snyder was still directing was kind of like liken the Flash's running to like almost ice skating, which I think is a weird choice, but it just doesn't work for me, man. So visually, man, this movie just did not work.
I one quick point before we get to our final grades, Dave. I want to know what cursed universe that we're in, and I know that Rotten Tomatoes is cursed forevermore, tainted, if you will. How is this movie fresh at 65% and an audience score of 84?
I don't even know, man. I have no idea. I'm flabbergasted, and I walk into every comic book movie wanting to love it. Like, that's just, I love comic books. I just love these characters, and I love these stories, and I love DC, and I always walk in just wanting to love it. Like, just give me something to love. And this was hard to love, man. All right, Kris, final grades.
I really hated most of this movie. And the only positive outcomes were Kaye, who was criminally underused and killed off in a kind of sick and distasteful way, and Keaton in the same regard. Like, you bring him back just to kill him off in this endless cycle of death. And then the whole stereotypical, like, hippie cooks for us as he's explaining a whole lot of exposition. It's a D minus.
Yeah, who made Batman the time travel expert, by the way?
Yeah, D minus, and that's being generous. What about you?
You know that I'm the harder grader. So my benchmark would be: is there something redeeming in this movie that makes me want to watch it again? Like, could I actually see myself, a year from now, of my own volition, sitting down and watching this movie again for funsies? No, I could not. Not even in a it's so bad it's entertaining, Mystery Science Theater 3000 way. Like, I hate to say it, man.
I would watch Batman and Robin on an endless loop before I'd watch this movie one more time.
And that right there it is. And that's why I think this movie has to get an F from me, man. It's just
I want to say this. I'm seeing a lot of acclaim for Ezra Miller's performance, and number one, that's kind of gross of you. Number two, I don't see it. There was that I meant to say this in the dislike. That was one of the hollow parts of the performance. We talked about this after you finished. Is like Ezra Miller was great in the Fantastic Beasts role, where they played this like creepy, shadowy character. Credence something, whatever.
Credence Clearwater Revival, I think, was the name of the character.
No, don't you besmirch CCR on this podcast. Have you ever seen the rain? No. Oh, yeah. So I don't get it. Their performance was hollow. It lacked emotion. It felt staged, and I got no emotion out of that performance. So I don't see it. Yeah.
Yeah, I'll go ahead and I'll echo that. I think young Barry in particular may be one of the most annoying performances this side of like anything. I'm not even quite sure how some of those lines were left in the script. Why is it so cold? It's the Arctic Barry. Like, Jesus Christ, dude. There was like zero likability in that character, and quote unquote our Barry was just kind of there.
Also, oh my God. Let's talk about it. Oh my God, I can't even get these words out. What was younger Barry's costume? You're going to have to get the bleep button. A bastardized version of a bat costume? That's his Flash costume? Like, ugh.
So D- from you, F from me. I found really very, very little to enjoy in this movie. It was kind of a slog to watch.
Okay.
And I'm glad I'm done with it.
Let's get to the stuff we liked.
Yes, please. Let's do. We're going to go ahead and take a quick break, and we'll be back with some nerd commendations, so stick around. Alrighty, folks, we're back, and it's time for this week's Kris, what's good?
Oh my gosh, dude. I got to show some love to my twin brother. Chris Hemsworth and I born on the same day. So I'm already tapped in on the first Extraction film. I absolutely loved it. And man, Extraction 2 did not disappoint. This is like quintessentially, I saw someone on Twitter say this is quintessentially what these Netflix movies should be. Like, stop trying to go after like the star power and whatever. Like, this is like a popcorn movie. This is like one of those like 90s like era like action flicks where like it's a nonstop thrill ride, adrenaline pumping. I love how global these movies are. The first one is set in South Asia, I believe, Bangladesh. This one is set in the country of Georgia, so like West Asia, Middle East kind of area, Eastern Europe, and it's just really really fun. And I think Hemsworth is like just a masterful portrayal as like this soldier of fortune, like mercenary. The cast is really great. Idris Elba makes an appearance. Golshifta Farahani as Nick Khan returns in this one, and I think she's absolutely money. Like, she's absolutely money, and so like I'm excited to see her in future projects because she outsold in this movie. So TLDR version, you have like the Georgian like crime syndicate, and one of them is imprisoned, and he takes his family into prison with him, and the wife wants to escape, and so they're the ones being extracted. It's a nonstop thrill ride. A lot of it is like these one camera extended shots, so it feels like atmospheric. It feels like you're there and this is happening. So nonstop thrill ride. If you have a couple of hours free, and you got some popcorn sitting at the house, go watch Extraction and Extraction 2. They're both great films. And you know what? I'm going to check out Ciudad, the graphic novel these are based on. Also, Joe and Anthony Russo are involved in this. So it's, if you like Winter Soldier and stuff like that, I don't know if this is on the level of that, but it's darn good filmmaking.
So I've not watched the first one yet. So clearly, by your high praise, I'm going to have to give this a shot. So I'm going to go ahead and put it on my list to watch.
All right, so this might be your favorite thing in nerddom right now, Dave. So go ahead and wax poetic.
Yeah, Star Trek: Strange New Worlds recently came back, and as of recording, the first 2 episodes have aired. And my God, if this is not the most Star Trek that ever Star Trekked. It just feels so close to the spirit of the original series, and so close to the spirit of what Star Trek is supposed to be all about. The first episode was a lot of fun, kind of fish out of water stuff with Spock, which, is always really welcome and fun. But the second episode, was amazing, dealing with number one, who is genetically modified, which is something that is outlawed in the Federation. So they put her on trial for falsifying her records, and it harkens back to some of those original series episodes where they did sort of trial proceeding episodes.
Yes,
and at the same time, it also harkens back to stuff that's very clear social commentary and very clearly draws parallels to modern day and issues that are common these days. And for that, and just how it makes a statement and how the story flows and everything, man, I had a tear in my eye by the end of this episode. It's just a very quintessence of Star Trek, and so I'm thrilled that Strange New Worlds is back, 2 episodes in, and I absolutely adore it yet again. I think it's probably some of the best Trek we've had in a very very long time. There's been a lot of Trek that I've liked, but I think this is probably the best it's been since DS9. And I absolutely adore this show, and just everybody should be watching Star Trek: Strange New Worlds. There is nothing more quintessentially Star Trek than this show.
Man, I'm all over the place when it comes to my viewing history. I've kind of pressed the pause button on my Buffy first watch. I'm rewatching Gargoyles a little bit. I played around with watching Battlestar Galactica. I'm watching The Bear, another great show. That's not a nerdy show, but God, it's good. It is everything everyone says it is. I'm watching Lower Decks because you binged all 3 seasons and I'm still in season 2. So you beat me at my own nerd commendation. And then I still have season 4 of Disco to watch. I've got 2nd season of Picard. And then
third season.
Yeah, and so I've got a lot of watching to do. I watched like the first 2 or 3 episodes of season 1 of this, but I think this might have skyrocketed to the top of my to watch list simply because those are some of my favorite episodes of Star Trek. Like I think it's called the Drumhead episode of Next Generation. Where Picard is just like full display of like being that moral compass and doing what's right, even in the face of standing up to Starfleet command. I think of the episode that you mentioned with not only Data being on trial, but also the one where Bashir is on trial in DS9
Yes.
because he's genetically modified as well. And just that biting social commentary is just, it has my butt in the chair, metaphorically speaking, because I'm usually laying in the bed watching stuff nowadays. But yeah, I'm here for it, and I can't say enough. Even in the 3 episodes I've seen of season 1, this cast, my God,
it's definitely sort of harkens back to classic Star Trek casts where just everything gels and the way they bounce off of each other is just pitch perfect. Alrighty, folks, there you have it. This was it for another episode of the Nerd Byword podcast. If you like what you just heard, find us on any app where you can find podcasts and drop us a rating and a review and subscribe so you never miss another episode. You can also find us on our very own website, nerdbyword.com.
And be sure to hit us up on social media at Twitter and Instagram at NerdByWord, individually That Nerd Kris and That Nerd Dave. And as always, stay well and stay nerdy.
The Nerd Byword is written and produced by Kris and Dave, 2 nerds with a love of all things pop culture. The podcast features music by Al Jimenez with additional drops composed by Joe Biondi. Our show art is by Ashery Design. Find us at nerdbyword.com and wherever podcasts are available.